Hello everyone, welcome. On this channel, we dive into pathophysiology and the mechanisms behind everyday clinical phenomenon. While everyone is trying to make complex things simple, my goal is to keep this complexity feel complex while being intuitive and clinically useful. My goal is to show you that the things are not so simple in medicine as most of us assume. So let's get started. Today we are going to explore how the body prevents blood from clotting spontaneously. Have you thought about building a synthetic tube that carries blood for 80 years without clotting and bleeding? And we have achieved some success when we designed our dialysis, ECMO, and alveolar circuits. However, one thing we have realized that blood hates foreign surfaces. So circulatory system isn't just a lining, it's an active organ. And to understand the system, we need to walk through the antithrombotic design. So the way to think about how blood prevents itself from clotting spontaneously, it applies three principles similar to starting a fire. First thing is compartmentalization. Keep the gas away from the matchstick. Second, keep your surfaces antithrombotic so that you don't get any spark. And lastly, if a spark is formed, break down that spark. That means break down those prothrombotic substances as they are forming. Compartmentalization is achieved by keeping the subendothelial procoagulant matrix and tissue factor away from the coagulation factor. And this is achieved by the barrier of endothelial lining, which along with glycocalyx provides steric hindrance to these coagulation factors. Similarly, platelets and epithelium lock away the chemicals that are involved in inciting the coagulation factors. And endothelium also actively secretes substances that will keep your calcium locked away from platelets. Any surface inside the blood, including your endothelium and your platelet surface, are antithrombotic. Platelets achieve this by hiding the negatively charged phospholipids away from the membrane. Your endothelium has many other chemicals studied in your glycocalyx, like antithrombin and thrombomodulin, which actively prevents thrombosis from happening. If some thrombin is generated accidentally, these guys will either bind to or activate pathways to prevent its further action. There are regulatory proteins in your blood as well. They break down prothrombotic substance as they form. And these are proteins like protein C, S, and antithrombin as we talked about. There are ectonucleotidases on your endothelium lining, which actively breaks down ADP that is secreted by platelets when they're activated. And there are other chemicals like ADAMTS13 which control your von Willebrand factor. So you can see there are multiple mechanisms by which your blood vessels are antithrombotic. So now you have a rough idea about the general process. Let's dive into details. The first is dilution and washing away. One of the things that you have been taught traditionally is this diagram of coagulation cascade. You have to understand that this whole processes that you have been taught doesn't occur in free blood. This whole pathway requires negatively charged surface to function. If anything that doesn't stick to the surface is washed away to be neutralized by enzymes and liver. So this is one of the reasons that you will notice why arterial clots occur less often and they are very different from the venous clots. We'll discuss that in some other lecture. This is also why activation in a test tube happens much faster than in vivo. So the timing on in vitro tests like TEG and ROTEM is not the same time that it takes time to clot in vivo. Clots form much faster in vitro. One of the most important processes that results in antithrombosis in your blood vessels is the shear stress. Shear is the drag you feel on your hand if you hold it outside of a moving car or moving water. And you would notice two things. This drag force increases as your viscosity increases. That's why you feel more drag in water than in air. And drag also depends upon the flow velocity. That means the faster your car is driving, the more drag you will feel. In an ideal fluid, since there is no friction, there is no shear. But in a real fluid, since there is friction between the layers of fluid and friction between the vessel wall and the fluid, the wall experiences a shear force because of difference in velocities. So the shear stress depends upon your blood viscosity and the velocity gradient. Since the blood viscosity is usually similar in the studies, most studies will report shear rate. Shear rate depends upon the volumetric blood flow rate, which will depend upon your cardiac output. It will also depend upon the radius of the vessel wall, and this is inversely proportional to the cube of the radius. So the shear force should increase with flow if the flow is laminar, and it would decrease if you have got stasis. The shear will also decrease with the turbulent flow because turbulence decreases the blood flow velocity. It also results in oscillatory changes in the blood flow, which we'll talk about significance in the next few slides. Shear rate also increases with decreasing radius, so shear is much higher in arterioles than in the larger vessels. To give you an example, the venous shear rate is around 0.35 dynes per centimeter square as compared to the arterioles, which reaches up to 70 dynes per centimeter square. So why do we need to know the shear stress? Shear stress is really important because it can be sensed by endothelium using mechanosensitive channel. So whenever these vessel wall feel a flow, these mechanosensitive channel transmit this force back to the cytoskeleton of your endothelium. And this shear is continuously felt by these cells, and the force transmitted to the cytoskeleton activates PCAM1. There are also piezo1 mechanosensitive channels, which result in influx of calcium, and both of these processes result in nitric oxide synthase activation. This results in a constant production of your nitric oxide. Similarly, this pathway also stimulates prostaglandin I2 release. So in a normal shear, there's a continuous nitric oxide and PGI2 release. There's also decreased adhesion molecules expression and upregulation of Kruppel-like factors too. And all these combined keep the antithrombotic tone in your blood vessels. So important thing to understand is arterial endothelium constantly feels the flowing blood and maintains its antithrombotic tone from this continuous production of nitric oxide and prostaglandin I2. Therefore, in a low or oscillatory shear, you lose this protective response, and therefore these areas are pro-inflammatory and prothrombotic. So this is one of the reasons why you see atherosclerosis at bifurcations. At bifurcation, the flow becomes chaotic, slow, and even reverses the direction, sometimes referred as oscillatory flow. This results in local decreased nitric oxide and prostaglandin I2, and these regions become pro-inflammatory. There are a few other processes that occur due to shear. Important among them is upregulation of thrombomodulin. Thrombomodulin, if you remember, activates your protein C after combining to thrombin, and this deactivates your intrinsic kinase complex and prothrombinase complex, which were the amplifiers of your clotting pathway. There is an upregulation of tissue factor pathway inhibitor and downregulation of tissue factor expression. TFPI is one of the molecules that gets activated by your extrinsic system and blunts the response of the extrinsic system. So while some shear is good, excessive shear force can cause platelet and von Willebrand factor activation, which are prothrombotic. Under normal arterial shear stress condition, which is about 50 dyne per centimeter square, von Willebrand factor is in folded state. If there is increase in shear stress, as seen in stenosis, vasoconstriction, or plaque formation, it unfolds at a threshold of around 150 dyne per centimeter square, and it exposes its A1 domain, which is highly sticky. If there is an area of injury, von Willebrand factor is going to bind glycoprotein 1b on the platelets and initiate clotting cascades. Very high shear stress can activate platelets as well. However, the normal shear is not enough to trigger the clotting because of your endothelium intactness and continuous production of nitric oxide and prostaglandin I2. So the role of shear in thrombosis is non-linear. In a moderate shear, there is upregulation of thrombomodulin and TFPI and continuous production of nitric oxide and PGI2, and therefore this keeps that vessel antithrombotic. If there is a low or oscillatory shear, it reduces your nitric oxide and prostaglandin I2 production, resulting in prothrombotic state. In a high shear, you activate your platelets and von Willebrand factor, and the surface again becomes more prothrombotic. Shear stress becomes very important in arterial stenosis and atherosclerotic plaques. So you can see that in the area of plaques, you have got high shear rate because of increased blood flow velocity, which activates your platelets and von Willebrand factor. There's a turbulence behind the area of clot, which results in low shear forces and oscillatory shear. This reduces your nitric oxide and prostaglandin I2 in this area. One thing you already noted that shear would be more important in arteries than in veins, as veins do not have much shear because the flow is pretty slow. In veins, the antithrombotic phenotype depends less on the shear and more on other factors like endothelial integrity, intact glycocalyx, and baseline nitric oxide and PGI2 production. Venous oxygen content is one of the more important factors that results in thrombosis in the veins. We'll talk about this in some other lecture. Nitric oxide, which is continuously produced because of the shear forces, keeps your cyclic GMP levels in the platelets high, and this reduces your intraplatelet calcium levels. Nitric oxide also prevents exocytosis of your Weber palette body, which contains your von Willebrand factor. Any process that would reduce the production of nitric oxide would be prothrombotic. So patients with diabetes, smoking, inflammatory disease, or oxidative stress, they are prothrombotic because of decreased production of nitric oxide. Intracellular calcium is one of the main activators for platelets. If calcium reaches above a certain threshold inside platelet, it stimulates phospholipase A2 via MAPK pathway. This converts your membrane phospholipid into arachidonic acid, which further gets metabolized to thromboxane. Thromboxane works on its thromboxane receptor and increases your intracellular calcium levels further in and around the stimulated platelets. This creates a vicious cycle of platelet activation and therefore clot formation. In the endothelium, a similar process stimulates the generation of prostaglandin I2, and there is a prostacyclin receptor in the platelet as well, which works to increase the intraplatelet CAMP levels, which reduces your calcium. So a continuous PGI2 levels lowers the intraplatelet calcium and prevents the platelet from getting activated. So unless there is an increase in cytosolic calcium, the cytosolic phospholipase A2 in platelets remains inactivated. So where does that PGI stimulus comes from? This comes from the shear forces, as we talked about before, and this comes via your PCAM1 activation and influx of some amount of calcium via your piezo-1 mechanoreceptor. Both of them upregulate COX-1 and 2. Thrombin, which is the end product of your coagulation cascade, also stimulates PGI2 production so as to limit the spread of the coagulation cascade via PAR receptor in the endothelium. Whenever a platelet gets accidentally activated, they release their granules, which contains ADP. Now, ADP is an important molecule in platelet activation as it can stimulate P2Y1 and P2Y12 receptor, and this results in increased intraplatelet calcium accumulation, resulting in more activation of platelets. If you remember, this is one of the receptor that is blocked by your molecule clopidogrel, that's Plavix. So to prevent platelet activation, your endothelium has ectonucleotidases, CD39 and CD73, which converts ADP to AMP and then further to adenosine. This helps prevent spread of activation of platelets. Adenosine also works on your A2A receptor, which stimulates adenyl cyclase to increase CAMP levels, thereby decreasing the intraplatelet calcium levels, thereby inhibiting activation. As we talked about earlier, negatively charged phospholipids are the nidus of the clotting cascade, and one of the more important phospholipid is your phosphatidyl-serine, which is highly negatively charged. This molecule always wants to get outside to the surface and stimulate your clotting pathways. So there is an enzyme called flippase, which uses ATP and keeps on pushing it inward against its concentration gradient, and this keeps the surface of the platelets neutral and therefore prevents any initiation of your coagulation. Similarly, your glycocalyx and endothelial cells lock away your negatively charged subendothelial matrix composed of collagen away from platelets and coagulation factors. So the thrombus formation only occurs in the areas with endothelial damage. Von Willebrand factor is one of the important molecules which helps stick the platelets together and with the subendothelium. There's always a slow release of von Willebrand factor in the bloodstream. Since these guys are really long molecules, and the longer they are, the more stickier they are. So your liver makes a molecule called ADAMTS13, which breaks them down into monomers and makes them less sticky. There's a condition called TTP in which there is increased thrombus formation due to lack of dysfunction of ADAMTS13. If you have thrombin generation, there are molecules in your endothelium like antithrombin which bind to thrombin irreversibly and reduce their local levels. There are other molecules in the blood like alpha-2 macroglobulin which physically cases the thrombin. So deficiency of antithrombin is one of the thrombophilic condition resulting in thrombosis of lower legs and pulmonary embolisms. There are other safeguards present in the system as well. Substances that initiate clotting also initiate anti-clotting. So thrombin, which is the final molecule from your intrinsic and extrinsic pathway, also initiates the process of limiting clot production by activating protein C. Activated protein C degrades the amplifiers such as intrinsic kinase complex and prothrombinase complex. We'll discuss more about the regulation of thrombin in some other lecture. The weeble pellet bodies in the endothelium also have TPA, so there is a slow release of TPA from these as well, similar to von Willebrand factor. The low level of TPA dissolve any accidental clots that are formed. So you can see there are many complex mechanisms which helps body maintain its antithrombotic tone. To summarize, the important among them are compartmentalization, where your coagulation molecules are kept separate from your subendothelial procoagulant matrix and tissue factor, a constant shear force that's present in your arteries and to the lower extent in the veins results in constant production of nitric oxide and prostaglandin I2, which keeps and maintains the antithrombotic tone. They keep the intraplatelet calcium levels low, and platelets actively keep the negatively charged phospholipids inside. In case of accidental thrombin generation, there is antithrombin present in the endothelial lining, and if platelets accidentally get stimulated, there are ectonucleotidases which would cleave the ADP back to adenosine. There are molecules like ADAMTS13 which keeps your von Willebrand factor under control. I hope this was useful to you. In the next lecture, we'll discuss how hemostasis starts, and we'll see that it starts even before your platelets are activated and your coagulation cascade is triggered. There are many other mechanisms that results in hemostasis, so we'll see it is not as simple as we have been traditionally taught. Thank you.